Okay, so I'm happy to talk to you right now about The Great Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street by Herman Melville. This is one of the greatest stories ever, one of my personal favorites. It's definitely sort of a ridiculous story. In some ways, it's very straightforward. In other ways, it's absolutely inscrutable. And it's sort of our job as readers to unpack things. It's one of the type of story where if it starts to head in a certain direction, you start to feel a certain way about a character that might just be Melville sort of messing around with us, and us sort of unpacking all of that and figuring out what he's talking about is one of the funnest things about it. Just to give you a little bit of background on it, it was written in 1853. Some would say in response to the failure of some of Melville's other works, including one that would ultimately come to be recognized after Melville's death as one of the greatest works of American literature ever written, Moby Dick. That book was not received well when it first came out. Melville was sort of laughed at in a sense, and of course time has vindicated him. But some say that Bartleby and sort of the types of things that it brings up, the ideas that it brings up about success and all of this, are responses in that regard. Another few things to bring up are, first, Melville's vocabulary. He definitely is not afraid to use the full range of vocabulary possibilities. So if you, when reading this, do or have encountered words that you don't know, my advice is to look them up. Because he uses a lot of really interesting words that are actually kind of funny and unique, and it'll be good for you to have them as part of your vocabulary too. But I don't fault you if when you read this, you come across some you don't know, because we're not all Melville, right? Some other things about this that it brings up is its role as part of several movements. One is obviously it's a part of the Romanticism movement. Its emphasis on the self, for example, its sort of criticism of culture and mainstream culture, and also its technical innovations. But then it's also representative of sort of the absurdist movement, the idea of absurdism, the ridiculosity of the scenario of the story is part of it, and also the idea that just it's a short story. At this point in time when this story was written, the short story was a relatively new model. Up until then, it was basically, it was a very poetry-heavy type of thing. So, with all of that in mind, we have the story Bartleby the Scrivener. It's based around two main characters. One is the narrator, whose name we never get. He's the one who's telling the story to us, and we sort of, are riding along this path with him and his thought process as he deals with his newest employee, Bartleby. Bartleby, when hired, is a great employee, does everything he's supposed to do, but eventually he just stops. He stops doing what he's supposed to do. When he's asked to do something, he just responds, "I would prefer not to," which is one of the greatest phrases in all of literature. Next time your boss or a friend or somebody tells you to do something, just say, "I would prefer not to," and you would be tapping into a great legacy of denying responsibility. And you'd be very ironic and hilarious, even if nobody knew what you were talking about. But the thing is, with this whole "I would prefer not to" situation, is that Bartleby just refuses to cooperate. He goes so far as, the boss, asks him to copy all these, different tasks, because that's what a scrivener does, copies documents. He won't do it. He asks him to read things aloud so that they all, can double check documents. He refuses to do it. He even is asked to help somebody tie a package, and he just won't do it. So this brings up some big things, because the narrator doesn't know how necessarily to deal with this. He even says, this great quote, "Nothing so aggravates a person as a passive resistance," which I think is a fantastic quote and a really interesting idea to consider. But ultimately, the narrator tries to find connections with Bartleby. He doesn't just want to kick him out. He tries to accommodate him. He tries to work with him. He says even, "Both I and Bartleby were sons of Adam," right? Like trying to, bring all of this stuff together, trying to see the camaraderie and the connection between them. And it only starts to get problematic for the narrator when people start saying bad things about him, as a lawyer and as a businessman because of this weirdo that he keeps in his office, Bartleby, who refuses to help anybody. Ultimately, the narrator even moves offices. He relocates to try to escape from this, but ultimately he's called back to deal with the problem again. Bartleby is, in the end of the story, hauled off to prison. And the narrator just keeps trying to help him, but ultimately there's absolutely nothing he can do to make this situation work. So that's the basic thrust of the story, which is, not a whole lot happens in a sense, but where the story gets fascinating is in what on earth all of this means. Okay, what does it represent? So obviously this is subtitled A Story of Wall Street. So this idea of capitalism is a big part of the picture. Some people say that capitalism, in a sense, is the source of Bartleby's malaise. It's why he doesn't want to do anything. He feels like he's trapped in a dead-end job. He can't, work his way up. That's the cause, that the soul-crushing nature of capitalism and working on Wall Street, is what brings him down. Other people say that capitalism is, in fact, Bartleby's salvation because it's the only reason he has anywhere to go. If it weren't for capitalism providing, this sort of situation where he can have a place where he can stay and, be, that he would be completely on his own and would, meet his fate at an earlier time. So you see, even in that little thing regarding capitalism, you have two diametrically opposed interpretations. And we, as the reader, are sort of free to pick and choose and sort of decide and debate what ultimately it means. And this is the beauty of the work, as its openness to interpretation. Some people also, debate Bartleby. Some people have come up with the interpretation that Bartleby, because he doesn't want to do anything, he's often described as being cadaverous, right? Like he's like this pale, wispy, like he doesn't say anything, he doesn't want to do anything, that people have basically just said Bartleby is depressed. He's suffering from clinical depression, and simply said that's what's going on in the story. I find that to be a suitable interpretation. It makes sense, but I also find it to be very sort of uninspiring. It's a little bit too simplistic. It's very cut and dry that, he's just depressed. Some other people bring up the possibility that maybe Bartleby is a representative of the idea of civil disobedience, okay, which is an interesting thing. And this relates to Thoreau, because Thoreau wrote his famous piece, Resistance to Civil Government, in 1849. This story was written just 4 years later. So that idea of civil disobedience, of passively resisting, a mainstream or an expected behavior, so as to protest it, was in the air at the time. So some people have looked at Bartleby as sort of a frustrator of earnestness, that he is the outcast who inflames the mainstream, and that when he says he prefers not to, he is a great revolutionary, a great rebellious individual who is standing up against the ways of capitalism, the ways of expectation, social conformity, all of these sort of things. See how that interpretation is a heck of a lot more interesting than just he's depressed, right? Then there's yet another interpretation that is maybe even more interesting than that, and it's the idea that Bartleby, quite directly, is a transcendent, enlightened individual who has recognized the Ecclesiastes-like futility of playing the game, of living here in this world and doing what's expected of you. The idea that Bartleby, in his sort of like Zen-like, acceptance of whatever comes his way, like the fact that he just sort of, wisps through life. He allows the universe to carry him with its currents, all the way to the point that he goes to prison where he, refuses food, sort of a Gandhi-esque hunger strike in a sense, a very sort of, denial of what is expected of him, that this is proof of his transcendent enlightenment. That's also an interesting interpretation. A lot of people have problems with that because it's like, he's just lazy. He doesn't want to do anything. But it's there as a possibility. All the way down to the idea that when Bartleby is staring at the brick wall, that sort of hilarious circumstance in which he's just looking out the window at this brick wall all the time. That, some people say like the brick wall represents, an economic wall that he cannot surpass. Other people say that, it's a spiritual symbol that basically if he can achieve satisfaction in his life from staring at a brick wall, that in fact he has awakened to the Whitman-esque beauty of all things in the world, right? Like, whereas he doesn't need to see a beautiful sunset to see beauty in the world. He can just stare at a brick wall and see transcendence. So that's another interesting thing. So you see, again, lots going on. Also, regarding Bartleby's ultimate passing, right? Like, there are many ways to look at this. The death, as his death is like the defeat of the uninspired. So he's like uninspired by the world, and this is his defeat. Or you can look at it as Bartleby's death as the Christ-like willingness to die for a cause, right? That he has this cause of inaction, this cause of non-involvement, and that he is basically undertaking a Christ-like willingness to die for that cause. Interesting, right? Also, there's the idea of Bartleby's death as a Whitman-esque nonchalance about mortality, right? Just like Whitman says, and to die is, different from what anyone thought and luckier, right? Like that basic gist, that death isn't so bad, that it's just part of the cycle, that this is Bartleby's willingness to continue on in that path. So there's lots of stuff going on. Then there's the narrator, this guy. What do we do with him, right? On one hand, he's very kind, right? He's a very nice man, but in a sense, that makes him kind of an idiot, because it's like you read him and you're like, oh, he's very thoughtful, he's very kindly, so that in some ways you could say like he's because he's representative, he's a lawyer, people just copy things, and he doesn't even do interesting law. He does like boring law, right? So he's a master in chancery. It's a very sort of dull job. So you can see him as sort of the gullible sheep-like cog in the capitalist machine. Or you can view him as representative of kindness and American benevolence, right? That he wants to help people. Bring us your poor, huddled masses, that sort of thing. Versus the narrator as a closeted socialist, right? Like the idea that he, in a sense, he's part of this capitalism, but he's actually representing this, Marxist idea of everybody sort of, of helping the little guy, everybody sort of, rising against the expectations so that you can uplift your fellow man, versus the idea of the narrator as sort of the unwanted savior in a sense. So there's lots going on, all the way down to when the narrator starts saying prefer and everybody else starts saying prefer. Is that the spread of revolutionary feeling? Is Bartleby's refusal to copy, right? That's very particular, a stand against conformity. There's lots of stuff happening. Also, in terms of things like fate, there's the idea that Bartleby is the albatross around the narrator's neck, okay? Or the idea that Bartleby is the only truly free man, that everybody else is subject to expectation, but he's the only representative of total freedom. Then there's ethics, what is right action? What should the narrator do? Like the narrator goes so far as to invite Bartleby to his house. Why would you even do this? But it's so benevolent, it's like, is that right action? What is the right action for Bartleby? Also, theory versus practice, the rationality of the narrator's action. He's very rational. He's like, well, surely, Bartleby will, act in a certain way if I say this certain thing to him. But then it's like, well, that's theory versus in practice, the real world application of rationality. Rationality is totally impotent when dealing with an irrational agent. And Bartleby is definitely an irrational agent. It's sort of like the idea of negotiating with terrorists. It seems like a nice thing to do, that you would negotiate and try to find common ground, but if you're dealing with an irrational agent, then by all means, you aren't going to get anywhere. So these are all things that are brought up. One of the most crazy interpretations out there that I think is really, really fascinating, but also probably just off the wall nuts, is the idea of Bartleby is sort of the representative of the psyche of the narrator. Okay, so that basically the narrator, as the main character, he's experiencing this, and that Bartleby is representative of the narrator's sort of suppressed desire to live a better life, right? The narrator wants, to remove himself from expectation, just like Bartleby has, and this is what Bartleby represents, but he, obviously can't do it. Also, of course, there's Nippers and Turkey. What do they represent? Why are they here? Are they pure comic relief? Or are they just signs of, like the up and down nature of humanity, people engaged in like shady dealings, people like going and getting drunk to try to deal with their pain, and being angry and being accommodating and, submissive versus outraged, all of these types of things. So we got all that stuff going on. And then we have this little bit at the end after Bartleby dies, and it says, he's with kings and counselors, which comes from Job. Job 3:13 to 3:14, which states, "Then I had been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth, which built desolate places for themselves," right? So the narrator at this point is sort of suggesting that Bartleby has built a desolate place for himself, that being death. Whether Bartleby would feel the same way, that's up to interpretation. But then, of course, we get this bit at the end, okay? The dead letter office. There's this great debate about whether this appendix on the story is really necessary. Why do we even need to know that, he worked at a dead letter office? Well, that's debatable, but it definitely adds a whole other layer of possibility. That the idea that Bartleby would work at this place where all the letters that, have nowhere to go end up, like the letters to God, the letters to Santa Claus, the letters to people who have died, the letters to people who can't be found, that all of these letters are there, and that Bartleby working there would have been subjected to this sort of misery. One other idea is that, in a sense, we all, as human beings, are dead letters. We all are sort of going somewhere that we're not going to get and that we're not going to be necessarily aware of. So lots of different possibilities there. Also, there's the fact the narrator, there's little hints in the story at the beginning. It basically says, I consider the sudden and violent abrogation of the office of Master in Chancery by the new Constitution as a premature act. So we get at the very beginning of the story that eventually, after all this happened, the narrator lost his job. Why did he lose his job? What do we make of Bartleby? What do we make of all of this? Ultimately, this story, absolutely brilliant. A lot going on. There is not necessarily a right answer. My advice to you is just look at the big picture questions, okay? Like, what does Bartleby represent? Try not to fall prone to the simplistic, Bartleby's just lazy, he needs to get a job, type of interpretation, because, while it may be valid, it's just a little bit less interesting to think about. So, work with the story, consider it, and most of all, enjoy it.